Okay, so I am going to try something new and continue teaching on the Genesis series that I have been doing at the church. We're up to Genesis 28, and so I'm going to try and do these kind of regularly. I can't promise anything right now because school is also very busy for me. So once I am done with my semester, then I'll probably get a little bit more involved. But for now, I'm going to try and do one every couple of weeks or so, maybe a little quicker than that. But like I said, today we are doing Genesis 28. And Genesis 28 is the story of Jacob's ladder. Okay, so there's some jumping around here. I'm sorry, this is all new for me, but I know that we're all stuck at home, so why not give it a shot, huh? So in chapter 28 here, there's going to be some jumping around in the plot that we need to take note of. Right away from the beginning, things are not lined up, and the brightness that's on me is my software opening up finally. But right away, things aren't lining up. The story kind of jumps around a bit. It presupposes a few things. And if you know me, what I'm interested in is getting us to understand just how much the author is presupposing about the reader, how much they assume that we know, how much they assume that we don't know, and then also the later editors and how much they assume we know and don't know. So yeah, there's some of that jumping around here, and so what we're going to do is we are going to read this just like I was doing when I was teaching it at the church, and then just kind of make some notes along the way. And I'm reading still from the Lexham English Bible, mostly because it's got some direct stuff of the Hebrew below it, so that helps me when we're going through in English to make some notes when I need to. I already read through verse 9 when the last time I taught at the church, so I'd encourage you to go find that video on thefathers.house, and it's just the last time I taught. I did Genesis 27, but we needed to go into the end of that story the end of that story is the beginning of 28. So we're going to start in 28:10, but we are going to make some notes about some things that happened earlier just to remind us what's going on. Isaac has called Jacob and he's blessed him, and he's told him not to take a wife from Canaan. And then Esau hears about that and goes out and quickly takes a wife from his own family. So there's kind of a play there going on. And then it's El Shaddai that Isaac calls upon to do the blessing. And that's in verse 3. Now may El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful. And a lot of scholars have noted this is called something like a blessing formula. And it's something that we see in other ancient texts at this time. So this is just kind of a common formula that they used. So we're going to get, though, into verse 10 and beyond today. And verse 10 is the beginning of Jacob's revelation at Bethel. And there's a lot to cover on Bethel, so I hope I can get to all that too, because Bethel has a lot going on. And for all of this, I'm using a lot of different commentaries and scholarly resources, but I am sort of sticking with Nahum Sarna for most of the commentaries so that it's accessible, because this is a commentary that anybody can get a hold of. It's the JPS commentary on the Torah. The guy's name is Nahum Sarna. He did Genesis and Exodus. So you can, and he's a rabbi, and so you can get a good perspective from someone who knows Hebrew history and Jewish history and all that. So Sarna says that this is where Jacob is beginning to get precedence, both in the narrative and in history, if we're going to call it that. So what he's saying is that this kind of begins Jacob's narrative. And so verse 10 of chapter 28, now this is the Jacob story. And I talked before about cycles in the ancient world, and that's, the Baal cycle is the story of Baal, the Baal, that's how you normally hear it said. So according then to Sarna, verse 10 begins the independent biography of Jacob the Patriarch. So it's kind of now like it's the story of George Washington, right? It's the founding father, and here is his official, authoritative biography. So from here on out, Esau begins to fade away, basically, and we hear of him little bits and pieces. We mostly hear of him as Edom later on, and it's in a pejorative sense. as Israel is kind of at war with Edom from now on in their history. Most scholars, again, are going to call this etiological. One of the things I like about Sarna is that he doesn't default to that for everything that we see in Genesis, even though there is a lot of that. And so he wants to give historical precedents where there might be some kernel living in the story. And so that's kind of why I've been using this commentary, in addition to the fact that he is a rabbi, and I want to give precedence to the Jewish people on something dealing with their sacred texts. So that's kind of where I come from with this, and so let's just get into it. It says, starting from verse 10, "Then Jacob went out from Beersheba and went to Haran, and he arrived at a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and slept at that place." Place is an important word in this event, in this part of the narrative, and so it's going to keep referring to place, and place is sacred. So let's go on. It says, "And he dreamed, and behold, a stairway was set on the earth, and its top touched the heavens. And behold, angels of God were going up and down on it." And she's buying a stairway to heaven. No. "And behold, Yahweh was standing beside him. And he said, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The ground on which you were sleeping I will give to you and to your descendants." Now, we know that Jacob knows God as Yahweh. We know that Jacob knows God as El Shaddai. We know that God knows Jacob as Elohim. Or Jacob knows God as Elohim. And so all of these names are starting to get interchanged, and later on we're going to learn some more about this and why this is happening. But just as kind of a preview to whet your appetite, I want to say that the Levitical priesthood and later priests did a lot to synchronize the ideas about God that we see in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, even though they left a lot of disagreement in theology in the text. So he says, "The ground on which you were sleeping I will give to you and to your descendants." Then he says, "Your descendants shall be like the dust of the earth." I know some people have said sand, but that's not right. It's dust. "And you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and through your descendants." There's a little theological point, right? Does Yahweh mean it when he speaks to Jacob and says, all of the families of the earth will be blessed through you and through your descendants? You know, how do you process that? So, "Now behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring to you this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you or for you." I guess that's important, huh? Is he promising it to him, or is he promising it for him? Is he doing it for him or doing it to him? "Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely Yahweh is indeed in this place, and I did not know." And this is kind of what we call a Yahwistic theophany, right? God showed up and nobody knew until after the fact. And this is the burning bush with Moses later on. You know, we see this in Exodus. Moses encounters God and doesn't realize it until later. It says, "Then he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is nothing else than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And so when we read this in English, we see, oh, the house of God, that's neat, and we just go right along. But what he's actually saying is, how awesome is this place? This is nothing else than Bet El Ohim. And Ohim, sorry. And so it's Bethel. And so he's naming this place, but it's also kind of like he's saying what the place is, okay? And he says, "And this is the gate of heaven." And I'm sure there's some stuff that we could really dig into there, but we're not gonna. It says, "And Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he put under his head and set it up as a stone pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel." Imagine that. He just said, this is the Beit Elohim, and so now he's saying this is Bethel. So he called the name of that place Bethel. However, the name of the city was formerly Luz. Okay, and we've talked about this when the editor or the author or the priest later, or the whoever put this stuff together, when they did that, they threw in little notes along the way. And so, what most scholars that I've read are going to say is that something like this, and he called the name of that place Bethel, was probably the historical story end, at least that part of the story. But, well, what did it used to be? Well, we know that this city Luz used to be here, so they'll throw that into, oh, it was this. So this is one of those places where the author is making an assumption that both Bethel and Luz. Okay, so the reader here is supposed to know what these places are. I mean, if the name of the city was formerly Luz, it makes no sense to somebody that doesn't know that there's a place called Luz. Okay, so they're not keeping a historical record here in the sense that we would think of it. They're telling a story. Okay, it goes on and says, "And Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and protect me on the way that I am going, and gives me food to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return in peace to the house of my father, then Yahweh will become my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar shall be the house of God," again, shall be the Bet Elohim. This stone shall be the Bet Elohim, okay? "And all that you give to me, I will certainly give a tenth to you." Okay, so that's the end of chapter 28. So let's go through this now, and I'm going to mostly be quoting Sarna here because he's got the best information. But, as far as other sources go, I've been also using Gordon Wenham, Klaus Westerman, who's back there, Von Rad even a little bit still. I know these guys are kind of old, but they've got some good information. Spicer. So Sarna says about this whole situation, he says it was customary for the devotees of any religion, and I'm summarizing, to sleep in the kind of locality, the area of sacred temples. And the purpose of that was to invoke the deity to reveal its will or to do some blessing. And so Sarna says it this way. He says, "However, the present narrative emphatically dissociates Jacob's experience from this pagan practice by stressing the wholly unplanned nature of his stopover, the complete anonymity of the place, okay, and the total unexpectedness of the theophany. Here it is God who freely takes the initiative in revealing himself to an amazed Jacob." And so what he's saying is, Yahweh's response to Jacob here isn't a response at all. He's taken the initiative and he's gone to talk to Jacob. And so this isn't like what we see in other ancient Near Eastern customs. And so, in many ways, we've talked about this a lot. What the Bible's doing is it's upsetting the culture around it as it's telling its own story about the origins of that same culture. And so in the ancient world, like he said, these people would go sleep in the area of a temple, right, a house of God, a Bethel, and would wait for this deity to reveal its will or pour out a blessing. And so it's a response to the devotion of the worshiper, right? And in this instance, Yahweh isn't interested in that. What Yahweh's interested in is, well, this is the person who I'm going to put the plan through. Okay, and remember what we're interested in is this is what the story says. Okay, we're not interested in what does this mean for us later on if we're Christians or if we're Jews or if we're atheists or any of that. We're looking at what the story actually says and how it lives in its own context and where it exists in its own context. Okay, and then in verse 19, he named that site Bethel, but previously the name of the city had been Luz. And I said, who is the author talking to here? What are they assuming that we know? This seems strange. I don't know of any place named Luz. What am I supposed to know here? So some scholars are going to give this little blip of text to an editor, a priest later on who's reading the text and coming through and kind of harmonizing some things. Others are going to say, no, this is the same author that is just letting you know what they're saying here. But in either respect, the writer or the editor is assuming that the reader knows both place names. Okay, so this isn't something that they're assuming is going to be read 10,000 years in the future where these place names aren't known anymore. So But Sarna has something interesting to say here, too. He says, it should be noted that the text carefully differentiates between the site Makom of Bethel and the city of Luz, even though it implies that the name Bethel displaced an earlier name Luz. So he's making a distinction here between the word site, or place, which is Makom in Hebrew, and the city of Luz, which, city is a different word, and it's not even really here. So the text carefully differentiates between the site of Bethel and the city of Luz, even though it implies that the name Bethel displaced an earlier name Luz. This conforms to Joshua 16:2, which clearly treats Bethel and Luz as two distinct, coexisting entities, the latter being situated west of the former. On the other hand, the identity of the two localities is again asserted in Genesis 35:6, Joshua 18:13, and Judges 1:23. The most likely explanation for the discrepancy is that Bethel was originally applied solely to the cultic area outside the town of Luz. And when a scholar says cultic, they just mean the religious area. So it's where the religious group goes to do their worship acts. As Bethel grew in fame and importance, the name was gradually extended to the urban area as well. Eventually it eclipsed Luz, which fell into disuse. And so all of that really means that there's another ideological element here. It's telling us how the area became known as the area we know as Bethel, where we is Israel at the time. Okay, and then verse 20 and 21 are kind of interesting because it kind of looks like Jacob's saying, hey, if you'll do this, then okay, fine. I'll let you be my God. And so it looks like this conditional promise that Jacob is giving to Yahweh here, but that's not what's going on. Again, Sarna says, the structure and style of his vow is in accord with a pattern known also from the story of Jephthah in Judges 11:30-31, of Hannah in 1 Samuel 1:11, and of Absalom in 2 Samuel 15:8. In each case, the desire of the speaker is formulated as a condition whose fulfillment is wholly dependent upon God's providence. The suppliant solemnly undertakes to discharge some special obligation when this materializes. Jacob's vow is unique in that all the desired conditions have already been unqualifiedly promised by God. And so what Sarn is noting here is that the response that most people give to God is oh, well, okay, this is off in the future, and I'll do this if you'll do this. But with Jacob, what he's saying is, no, God's already promised all of it, and Jacob's really just kind of responding and saying, I have no other choice but to say, yeah, you're my God. He goes on, he says, this peculiarity is noted in Genesis Rabbah 74, and this is a rabbinic commentary on Genesis, where two possible explanations are given. One is that the true sequence of events has been transposed in the narrative so that, in reality, the theophany becomes a response to Jacob's vow, which actually preceded it. Okay, so what he's saying here is that one explanation given by rabbinic exegetes of this is that, oh, well, actually in the story, the events got superimposed, and the theophany happens after Jacob makes his vow, and so God's responding to Jacob's faith, right? Jacob's giving out his prayer of faith. He said the sinner's prayer, and so God responded to him. Okay, so that line of thinking is very, very old. It's nothing new. It's nothing that was created with the evangelicals. And then he goes on and says, the other is that verses 20 to 22 are not so much conditional as temporal. Jacob pledges himself to a certain course of action as an expression of gratitude to God after the promises will be fulfilled. According to the natural order presupposed by our story, Jacob's vow cannot be understood as bargaining with God, since all that he asked for has already been promised. So Sarna's kind of given us our answer there, and I don't think that we need to focus too much on anything else. So the last thing I want to look at here is verse 22, where he says, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar shall be the Bet Elohim. And so Bethel shall be the Beth Elohim, right? So come on, it makes sense. It sounds the same. And what is Bethel? What is Bet Elohim? What are these things? Why are they, connected? So he says in 8th century, An 8th century BCE Aramaic treaty inscription from Sphire in Syria terms each upright stone on which the treaty is inscribed, and this is it's an English way of expressing Semitic roots, and so it's an NTSB are the consonants that make this up, Natsab. And so this is the Aramaic cognate of Hebrew matseva, both words being derived from the same stem, N, T, S, and V. That text also designates these identical stones abode of the gods, Bete Elohe, when they serve as witness to the treaty. It is clear that matseva is the generic term for an upright stone slab irrespective of its function. Bet Elohim, God's abode, is a specific subcategory of the matseva. It is so called because it symbolizes the divine presence that monitors the fulfillment or infraction of the terms of a treaty or vow. That the expression Bet Elohim in this special technical sense once had a far wider currency is proved by the fact that it found its way into Greek usage. Hellenistic writers mention Bethels as certain sacred stones supposedly possessed of divine or demonic powers. In addition, as shown in Excursus 22, and I'm going to read a little bit of his Excursus 22 in a minute. It's a little bit long, probably won't read the whole thing, but there's some stuff in there that I think is important because it kind of summarizes what's going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, that the average reader at the time would have known about. So he says, in addition, there is plenty of evidence for a pagan god named Bethel, who would either have been the deified sacred stone or the watchful divinity thought to reside in the stone of testimony. And so we see that stone of testimony pop up in Exodus, right? And it kind of is with them, and there's the Ark of the Testimony. And so the testimony is the presence of the deity. And so it's not unique to Israel to believe that the presence of their deity inhabited their places and their stones and their altars and their arks. And so, I want to help us understand what's true when we're comparing the Bible to other ancient Near Eastern beliefs and texts and customs, and what's been sensationalized by exceptionalists of a couple different religious traditions. The Bible isn't this totally unique document that exists outside the world of other documents. It's a document it's a collection of documents, first of all, that exist in their own context, that have a context together, that have a context in history, that have a context in time, in modern time. And so it's not something that we can just simply say, oh, it means this. Okay. He says, of course, in the mouth of Jacob, the term Bet Elohim means that the stone is a testimony to the divine presence. And so he puts that in caps. And so that's his caps and his emphasis. And so, this is one of those places where we can separate the scholarly opinion from the data, right? Or the data have been telling us that there are multiple usages of Bethel, meaning place where a deity actually resides. Okay, and so when Sarna breaks this out and says, oh, of course, in the mouth of Jacob, the term Bet Elohim means that the stone is a testimony to the divine presence. It's not where the divine presence actually lives. But that's not really what the text says. And what the text actually says is that he says this pillar shall be the house of God. And so it takes some other work to bring that in. And I know that Sarna is saying that in confidence and in a right way. And so, that's not there in the text. That's something that takes other work to bring in. And so if this text were ripped out and you're just reading the book of Genesis, are you going to get that? Are you going to know? I don't know. So. Okay, so now I want to read just a little bit of this Bethel excursus that Sarna has written. And this is all in the JPS commentary, and it's not a cheap commentary. But if you're into Genesis and it's like your thing, and reading that ancient kind of text does it for you, then I highly recommend Sarna's commentary. Okay, so we're going to read about 3 or 4 paragraphs of Sarna's article on Bethel here, and like I said, this is at the end of his commentary, so if you get that, you can read it. Otherwise, you'll have to just record and write down my voice or something. I don't know. So he says Bethel, and this is kind of jumping into the article a little bit because I think some of the introductory stuff is interesting but not important to what we're talking about. So he says Bethel is first mentioned as a national Israelite religious center in the period of the Judges, when it had already acquired prestige by virtue of housing the Ark of the Covenant and the ministry of Phinehas, grandson of Aaron. And so we all know Phinehas, right? He's the guy, right, that did the slaughter. So in Samuel's day, it was a focus of religious pilgrimage, and with the secession of the northern tribes after the death of Solomon, King Jeroboam selected Bethel to become the major cult center of the kingdom of Israel in rivalry with Jerusalem. So Bethel is an important site, obviously, right? And later in history, it's an even more important site. And so part of what the author here is trying to do is to justify why Bethel is such an important site. Why should we even think about putting the capital in Bethel? Well, because Jacob is the one who named it. And yeah, David did Jerusalem, but man, it goes all the way back to Jacob with Bethel. So you see, it's got some importance for us. King Jeroboam selected Bethel to become the major cult center of the kingdom of Israel in rivalry with Jerusalem. In the days of Elisha, not like the old Robin Marks song, like these are the days of, and not that one. So in the days of Elisha, a school of prophets functioned there. But in the 8th century BCE, the Bethel cult earned the outright condemnation of Amos as well as of Hosea. The latter, a northerner who was even more severe in his castigations, actually designated Bethel Beth Aven, so Bet El, house of God, as Bet Aven, house of delusion. Yet even the destruction of the kingdom of Israel in 722, 721 BCE, this is by Assyria, did not put an end to the sanctity of the place. Its priesthood continued to exist for another 100 years, until the Bethel cult center was finally destroyed by King Josiah of Judah in the course of his religious reforms. In light of the discredited history of Bethel and its censure at the hands of the prophets, the positive associations of Jacob with the site are highly interesting, and this is something that we need to kind of pay attention to, because this is something that the Bible does do that a lot of ancient texts don't do, and that is to kind of reveal its embarrassments, right? So Jacob is associated with this place that is known to be a cult site where people are worshiping, and we're about to find out here in just a minute, another god, okay, not Yahweh of Israel, but Bethel, okay. In light of all this, the positive associations of Jacob with the site are highly interesting. They could not have been invented at a late period, nor have the early traditions been expunged or re-edited to conform with later events. And so what he's saying is the fact of their existence in the text is evidence for the historicity of the story. Whether that means that everything about the event is totally historical or not is not the point. What it means is that in some point in Israel's history, everybody knew for a fact that Jacob named the site Bethel. Okay, and his association with that site is irrefutable, because later on, it's not a site you want to be associated with. And so why tell the story that way if it wasn't really that way? So then he goes on and says, yet this verdict does not exhaust the subject, for there is much evidence of a varied nature for Bethel as the site of an ancient pre-Israelite sanctuary. This evidence may be summarized as follows. Okay, so number one, he says, while the name itself might simply mean house of a god, like the Ugaritic Betil and Akkadian Bet Eli, it is far more likely, on the analogy of other Canaanite place names, that the second element is none other than El with a capital E, like the God, okay? And so El is the supreme God. And he goes on, he says, the name of the supreme God of the Canaanite pantheon. And so when we see God in the Bible, sometimes that's Elohim, but sometimes it's El. And so there's some debate here. Is this do they actually worship the Canaanite deity El, or are they just taking that word and making it God? Is that like when we say God, does that mean like when Plato said God? When Plato said Theos, he's talking about Zeus, but when we say Theos, we're talking about Yahweh, so, or Jesus, so it's kind of how do we process all that? So he says the name of the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon, Bet El, would then follow the well-established pattern of temple names formed by prefacing Bet to the god name. Examples are Bet Anath in Joshua 19:38, Bet Azmaveth in Ezra 2:24, Beth Baal Berit in Judges 9:4, Beth Baal Meon in Joshua 13:17, Beth Koron in Joshua 16:5, Beth Dagon in Joshua 15:41, and Beth Shemesh in Joshua 15:10. In all such cases, the name of the sanctuary gradually encompassed the adjacent or surrounding urban area as well. So what he's saying is there's a historical precedent here for when a city or an area, a cult area, gets named after a deity, the house of this deity, that the city name that kind of erupts out of that is usually because it was devoted to an actual deity and not just any deity. And so Bethel would be house of El, that god. Okay, so that was number one. Number two, he says, the city of Bethel is now generally identified with the modern village of Betin, which lies about 10.5 miles north of Jerusalem and is situated some 2,800 feet above sea level. Blessed with an abundance of springs and strategically located at the junction of a north-south highway with an east-west road, the area provided convenient and attractive grazing grounds for pastoral nomads. Archaeological excavations have shown that as early as 3500 BCE, a bare mountaintop there served as a great open-air shrine. So this is a long time ago. In the 19th century BCE, a temple was erected over it. A stone pillar was discovered there in situ. It is now certain that Bethel was a sacred Canaanite site before and during the patriarchal period. And so we've got this going on all throughout Genesis, okay? At first, they're smashing Babylon in the face with a retelling of the Enuma Elish as the flood story. And so Genesis 1 to 11 is the redoing of the Enuma Elish. And so it's the upsetting of Babylon's deities, right? And all of their sacred sites and all of their deity names become just simple places in Israel's stories, right? So they're deliberately doing this and establishing themselves as on the right side of history and their God as the right God and his name as the name above all other names, right? That phrase doesn't get invented in the biblical text. That's something that is like a core belief to Yahwism and what later becomes Judaism, okay? Okay, and then he goes on, he says, number three, and this is going to be the last one we read in full. There is plenty of evidence for the existence of a god named Bethel, and this is what we talked about, who derived his name from the holy place. The parallelism is Jeremiah 48:13. The parallelism in Jeremiah 48:13 shows that there were Israelites who worshipped a god of that name. And Moab shall be shamed because of Chemosh, as the house of Israel were shamed because of Bethel, on whom they relied. Okay, that's a whom, that's not a what. So it's not a place that they're relying on, it's a deity, it's a being. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites, and in this context, Bethel must also be a deity. Okay, this is Sarna. In fact, he is explicitly referred to in the list of deities who sanctioned the terms of the treaty made between King Esarhaddon of Assyria and King Baal of Tyre in the 7th century BCE. May Bethel and Anath Bethel deliver you to a man-eating lion. Okay, so what Sarna does here then is he summarizes all of this and kind of shows what Israel's writers, what their pre-Israelite writers were doing in order to separate them from the world around them, okay? And this is where we do find some difference in the biblical text. Like I said, a lot of times the authors are doing that even in non-biblical text. They're trying to separate themselves from the world around them and in their worldview. And we still do that today, right? The reason we classify things scientifically is because we're trying to separate everything out from the world around it, so that everything is easily categorized. And we all know that categories don't work. Okay, so he says, with great subtlety, the narrative dissociates absolutely the sanctity of the place from its pagan antecedents, meaning he's not connecting the story of Bethel with all that stuff before it. So this is accomplished by the following devices. Although the site is repeatedly termed a makom, which often means a sacred place, and which it was to the Canaanites, Jacob does not go there by design. He stumbles upon it by accident, only because nightfall happens to him there. And so here I kind of agree with Sarna, right? Like, the story doesn't say that Jacob went to Bethel because he wanted to go there. It just, he kind of like landed at this place and suddenly doesn't have anything else he can do. And so what? I'm going to go to sleep here, and he ends up having a dream. Okay, I can see that. The stone he takes for a pillow is any stone, one just lying around. It becomes a pillar only to commemorate the theophany, but possesses no inherent sanctity. Again, true. The event itself, because it happens in this particular place, generates astonishment, yet the place is nameless. It has no prior history for Jacob. Again, true. Jacob names the place the house of God. Why? Because he assumes that he stumbled into God's house because he just met God there. And who does he call God? El. Okay? So later we're going to talk more about this, but, is it the priests who kind of weave these stories together so that El, Yahweh, El Shaddai, Elohim, all these names become one deity? Or is it that these traditions all recognize the same deity and what they were saying and just had different words like we would today? If we were, different tribes come together and we all speak a little bit different dialect. Well, I call him the Lord Jesus, and I call him sweet baby Jesus, and I call him Jesus Christ, Son of God. We're all talking about the same person. So that may be something to think about here. Okay, so Sarna goes on, he says, finally, there is the emphasis on the divine name, Yahweh. It is he who is standing there, who speaks to Jacob, and who identifies himself as the God who made promises to his forefathers. Surely Yahweh is in this place, exclaims Jacob on awakening, and it is Yahweh from whom he seeks protection. As if further to underscore the dissociation from the pagan antecedents, when the patriarch returns from Mesopotamia years later and travels to Bethel, he orders the members of his household to rid themselves of alien gods, to purify themselves, and to change their clothing before approaching the site. So there's something there. Jacob actually seems to believe that this is where God lives, like this is actually the house of God. And so this belief that God is everywhere is not germane, I guess, to this story, at least, if not the whole early part of Genesis, because we've seen God all the way from the beginning. Genesis 1, God's walking in the garden, right? That he's not everywhere, he's walking in the garden. And I'm saying he because the deity in the story is a male. Okay, it's not because I believe that God is a man. Okay, that's not. Again, we're concerned with what the text actually says, and the deity in the text is a male, and that's how it works. And so, like I said, God's walking in the garden. God has to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see what's going on, and has two attendants with him. And it's three men approach Abraham, and it's like they don't know what's going on. So not only is God not everywhere, God doesn't know everything in this early part of the biblical text here. And so, if this is all you had, and you're looking at early Israel, and they've got a Torah, they've got their 5 books, and maybe some other writings, but not a lot. Like, their view of God isn't going to be what our view of God is, where God is omniscient and God is omnipotent, and things that we've worked out because of later philosophers, and guys that maybe preceded Jesus a little bit, but we're way after the biblical authors of the Hebrew Bible. We have these philosophical beliefs about God that aren't really found in the Torah, that aren't found in the Pentateuch, that aren't found in the early parts of the Hebrew Bible. God is a very personable and personish and personal God at times, and other times very off-putting and off-standing and not interested and very ethereal. And so which one is it? Is that the same deity both times? Is that different viewpoints on one God? How does this all work? So this is kind of what we're getting into. So Sarna finishes this and says, the biblical narrator ignores the pre-Israelite sacred history of Bethel. The true sanctity of the site commences only with God's self-revelation to the patriarch. And so what he's saying is that, we know that there was a site named Bethel there, that's fine, but it's because Jacob named it Bethel, not because it was already named Bethel. So he's kind of denying that Jacob even had any idea about the other deity. And why would the author do that? Well, because the author's presumed audience would have known that. And so the author is saying, like, hey, I know that you know what Bethel is, and I know that you know where Bethel came from, but let me just let you know that's not why Jacob did all this. Okay, so that's kind of what Sarn is saying. I tend to side with him on that. There are a few other viewpoints on that, but that's a good standard view. So that's the end of chapter 28. We're going to try and do these weekly, bi-weekly. I don't know how frequently. I'm very, very busy with school right now. So, and then also brewing is taking some time. So, if this is something that you are into, that you're interested in seeing more of, please subscribe to our podcast. Please subscribe to our Patreon. Please subscribe to the church podcast, where these are going to land eventually after they're done being edited for Patreon. So, yeah, and next time we come back, we're going to do Genesis 29. See ya.